This is going to be a quick video discussing how to make a material sheet to prepare for one of your labs in General Chemistry 2, Chem 116. So, first of all, before we even talk about how to make one, the first lab that you're doing is the chromatography lab, and I have already created the material sheet for that lab. So when you prepare for the chromatography lab, you're going to go to the chromatography page in Canvas and look at the material sheet that I already created for that lab, and you'll be able just to copy down the things that I already decided that you need to have. So for all other labs, for all future labs, after the chromatography lab, it's going to be your job to make your own material sheet before you come to lab. Now, again, there are blank copies of material sheets in the back of your lab manual, your Gen Chem 2 Fall 2020 lab manual that you get from the SCC bookstore. There are blank copies of the material sheet already there. So you're just going to be filling those out. Now, the purpose of a material sheet, it's to have so you have thought through the lab that you're going to be doing to the point that you know what equipment you need to get out, what chemicals you're using, and how much of those chemicals you need, how you're going to handle your waste, and any extra safety precautions you need. So, in other words, it's kind of a summary of the things you need and the important things you need to know before you do a lab. And we started making these when it was clear that students were not preparing for lab. And also, it's to help prepare those of you that are going on to higher level science labs, not just chemistry, but also biology labs. This is going to be expected for you to do this before you walk into any lab, but it's just going to be expected that you do it on your own. These material sheets are just giving us a way of easing into that, learning how to start thinking as a scientist to prepare for labs. So these material sheets, they're two-sided. There's a front and a back. Now on the material sheet, there's a spot for you to put your name. I truly believe you can handle that part all on your own. There's also a spot for you to write the title of the lab. That's right there. Okay. And then on the front page, there's the glassware and equipment section. So in this section of the lab, you're going to, after you read the lab procedure and watch the lab lecture of the procedure video that's on Canvas, you're going to think through any pieces of glassware or equipment that you're going to need to use to complete this lab. Some pieces of equipment and glassware are going to be called out specifically in the lab procedure. It'll say things like, pour this chemical into a 250 milliliter Erlenmeyer flask. Well, it specifically calls out 250 milliliter Erlenmeyer flask. So that is the name of a piece of glassware that you would write into this. And then the number needed column, you're going to just have to list how many of that type of glassware do you need. So some of the glassware and equipment, you're really pulling straight from the procedure. It mentions it, you write it down. All you have to do is then consider how many you need. For example, if you're doing 3 trials, and you have to use a 250 milliliter Erlenmeyer for each trial, then that means you need 3 250 milliliter Erlenmeyers. Some of the glassware and equipment, though, is maybe not as obvious. It's not specifically mentioned in the procedure. Things like every time you're going to use a volumetric pipette, you're going to need a pipette bulb. So a pipette bulb is a piece of glassware and equipment that you would have to mention. Another thing that wouldn't necessarily be called out directly are things like if you're using test tubes, the test tubes will be mentioned in the lab procedure, but the test tube rack, the thing that you're going to set the test tubes in, is something that you're going to have to list on your material sheet, but it probably won't be directly mentioned in the lab procedure. A really common one that gets forgotten are beakers. So anytime you're going to use a volumetric pipette to transfer liquid from one container to another, you're going to have to pour the chemical from its stock bottle, the pure bottle that it started in. You're going to have to pour that chemical into a beaker before you use the pipette. We always pipette directly out of beakers. So you're going to have to add beakers to your material sheet and think how many beakers are you going to need. Well, one for each chemical that you're going to have to pipette from or use any part of the lab. Another piece of glassware and equipment that you're going to use almost every week is going to be the analytical balance, which you can just call the balance. So that's a piece of glassware and equipment that you will need. You don't need to list things like calculator or pencil or goggles or gloves, things that are standard equipment that you would use for every single lab that you do. That would not be required for this. This is glassware that you're using to perform the experiment, and equipment you use to perform the experiment. Another set of things that are sometimes forgotten, anytime you're using a burette, you're going to need a burette clamp, and you're going to need a post to attach that burette clamp to. So if the lab tells you to use a burette, you're going to need the other things that go along with it. So you're just going to be listing with a pencil or pen, writing into this section all the pieces of glassware and equipment you can think of that you'll be needing for that lab. And again, you're going to be filling in how many of each piece of equipment you need. Often you just need one of some things, but sometimes you need a lot more. If you're using volumetric pipettes, you do need to be specific about what size of volumetric pipette you need. The lab tells you to use a 5 milliliter pipette. Write down 5 milliliter pipette. Don't just write down pipette. Okay, be specific. Now, for the chemicals section, that's where we're not looking at glassware and equipment. Instead, we're looking at the chemicals. There are 3 columns for this: the name of the chemical, the concentration of the chemical, and the total amount needed. The total amount needed will likely be in the unit of either grams, or milliliters, depending on what type of chemical it is. And the total amount needed is, I want you to think through the entire experiment for one specific chemical and calculate how much you would need for the entire experiment. The lab might tell you how much you need for 1 trial, but if you're doing 3 trials, you need to take that amount and multiply it by 3. And then I would go ahead and always round up a little bit, because this is kind of giving you the estimate of how much chemical you should pour out of the stock bottle into your beaker. It's giving you an estimate of how much you actually need. So the name of the chemical, you're going to list here. Now the concentration, sometimes in the lab it specifically tells you it's a 0.1 molarity, or it's a 3%, or whatever it is. So if you're given the concentration, you'll put it right there. Sometimes we work with chemicals that are not a mixture. Instead, they're pure substances. One of those chemicals you're going to use most weeks is deionized water. And its concentration, well, it's not a mixture. It's a pure substance. So you're going to write pure. So things like deionized water, or if the chemical is just mentioned and no concentration is given, so for example, like cyclohexane or aspirin or salicylic acid, chemicals that are listed in the procedure and you're measuring out their solid. So things like KHP. If they're not given a concentration, then they are pure substances. And then the total amount needed, again, you're going to be writing things like how many milliliters, how many grams. So you would have to determine based on the lab procedure how much you're going to need total. If you're using an unknown, which we do a lot in the lab, we use unknown chemicals, you're just going to write for the chemical name. We don't know what it is. That's the point. You'll just write that it is unknown as its chemical name. And then for concentration, you can either write unknown again, because again, we don't know, or you can write a question mark. But you do have to fill in the total amount needed, because you will know that information from the lab procedure. So for your material sheets, this is where you're going to start. Again, your lab procedure and the procedure lab lecture video are going to be your friends for this and figuring this out. This total amount needed is a really important column, so don't leave that blank. That's the thing that most people like to leave blank because they have to actually think through it. I believe in you. You can do it. So you do need to think through that. And when we come into the lab room and I have you get out your material sheets, this is what I'm going to be looking at. I'm going to a lot of times be focused on the front page, the glassware and equipment and the chemicals. And with the chemicals, I'm really going to be focusing on the total amount needed, because I don't want you to get 500 milliliters when you needed 5 milliliters, because you just wasted a whole bunch of chemical. So this material sheet, you complete it before lab, but during lab, you keep it with you and you will use it as you work through the lab procedure. And then it really helps you, be prepared. Okay, so the back page of every material sheet has 2 sections, the waste management and the safety concerns. The waste management, well, in the lab manual, the very last section of every lab procedure talks about waste. So you're going to be reading that section in the lab procedure and summarizing it here. It's a summary of at the end of lab and you've got chemicals and you need to know what to do with them. Do they go into the waste container? Do they go down the drain? Do they put in the trash can? So you're going to list the chemicals and how they're going to be disposed. Now, sometimes there's more than just chemicals to dispose of. Sometimes you have things that have to go in the broken glass box. So that will be listed here as well. So the proper disposal strategy are going to be things like in a waste container. So you're going to say waste container. Or sometimes the lab tells you to dump them down the drain. So down drain. Or in trash, or in broken glass. Okay, so you will have to read the procedure and again listen to the procedure lab lecture video, and you're just going to list the chemicals. Now sometimes you can group them together. Maybe 3 of those 3 chemicals get to go down the drain. So just list chemical, comma, chemical, down drain. Or if at the end of the lab, all of your chemicals are going to be mixed together because you're mixing them all together as the lab goes on, and all of them go into the waste container, you can do something like all chemicals go in the waste container. Then the last section of the material sheet is the safety concerns. And so the safety concerns, you are not going to have to list the stuff that you do in everyday safety, like wearing glasses, wearing long pants. It's things extra. Do you have to use a fume hood for certain chemicals? Are there certain safety concerns that I mentioned about, like acid burns or something? So these safety concerns are just above and beyond the normal safety precautions. You don't write goggles. You don't write long pants. You don't write closed-toed shoes. You don't even have to wear gloves unless the lab is being specific about something with the gloves that is different than normal. Okay, so this is, again, just kind of a summary of everything you're going to be doing in the lab, in terms of not so much the procedure, but all the stuff you're going to be using and how you're going to clean up.